In the autumn of 1825, on the high ground above Lake Hopatcong in northern New Jersey, a Morristown businessman named George Parrott McCulloch stood with two state commissioners and watched a crew of nearly 3,000 Irishmen begin to cut a ditch into the side of a mountain. The ditch they were starting that morning would, 6 years later, become 107 miles of artificial river. It would lift loaded coal boats 1,674 feet straight up into the air, drag them across the spine of New Jersey on iron rails, and lower them down the other side. No country on earth had ever tried to push a canal over a mountain like this. I have been reading the construction ledgers from that year, and I want to show you what these men actually built. I want you to picture, before we go any further, what the Morris Canal asked of the human body. The state of New Jersey, between the Delaware River at Phillipsburg in the west and Newark Bay in the east, is not flat country. The highlands cut across the northern third of the state in a chain of stubborn ridges. The summit at Lake Hopatcong sits 914 feet above the tide at Jersey City. To move 1 ton of anthracite coal from the Pennsylvania mines to the iron furnaces of Newark, the canal had to climb 760 feet up from the Delaware, hold that elevation, and then drop 914 feet down the other side into the salt water. Total vertical movement, 1,674 feet. Most of the men who did this work were paid $1 a day, sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, with a shovel, a pick, and a wooden wheelbarrow. I want to introduce you to 2 of them before we go any deeper. The first is the Bird family of Loch 2 East, in what was then called Port Orem and is now the town of Wharton. From the 1860s forward, 4 generations of the Bird family lived in the lock tender's house on the canal bank and worked the gates of that single lock. They were paid a small annual wage by the Morris Canal and Banking Company, given the house to live in for free, and given a small garden plot. The job ran 24 hours a day during the navigation season. Boats came through at all hours, knocking on the door at 2 in the morning, at 4 in the morning, with full coal loads behind tired mules. The Bird family answered every knock for nearly 60 years, until the canal stopped running. The records of the Morris Canal Banking Company pass on the family name. The first names of the individual lock tenders, the wives who cooked for passing crews, the sons who learned the wheel by the age of 10, are mostly gone. The lock is still there. The house is still there. The names are not. The second man I want to introduce you to is an Irish laborer, dead at maybe 25 years old, buried in an unmarked grave somewhere along the line of the canal in the spring or summer of 1832. He came over from Ireland with 3,000 of his countrymen to dig this ditch. He was paid $1 a day. He slept in a canvas tent in a row of canvas tents. There was no doctor, no clean water, no proper food. When Asiatic cholera moved up the canal line in 1832, hundreds of these men died inside of a week. The company buried them where they fell, in the fields next to the canal. The ledger gives no name, only a number. These are the 2 men I want you to keep in your head while I tell you what they built. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the men who ran the first iron machines, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, subscribe to Iron Pioneers right now. Hit the button. Come back. The idea started with a fish. In the year 1822, George Parrott McCulloch, a Morristown scholar and businessman of Scottish birth, was fishing on Lake Hopatcong in the high country of Morris County. McCulloch had been thinking for years about how to move Pennsylvania coal across northern New Jersey to the iron furnaces and the city markets along the Hudson. The mountains were the problem. The iron founders of northern New Jersey were starving for coal. The state was rich in iron ore and rich in timber and rich in water, but the cost of hauling a ton of coal over those ridges by wagon was so high that the Newark and Jersey City ironmen were going broke. Sitting in his small boat on Hopatcong that afternoon, McCulloch realized the lake itself sat at the high point. If a canal could reach the lake from both sides, the lake could feed it. The Summit Pound could be the lake. The water problem solved itself. He took the idea to Trenton. On the 15th of November in 1822, the New Jersey legislature appointed 3 commissioners to study the question. McCulloch was one of them. They walked the line. They measured. They turned in a report. On the 31st of December in 1824, the legislature chartered the Morris Canal and Banking Company, a private corporation with the right to issue 20,000 shares of stock at $100 a share. $2 million on paper. The first president of the company was Cadwallader David Colden, the former mayor of New York City, a man of weight in the financial community. The chief engineer hired in 1823 was Ephraim Beach, who had cut his teeth as an assistant engineer on the Erie Canal in upstate New York. The man who would design the most extraordinary part of the machine, the inclined planes, was James Renwick, a professor at Columbia College in New York. Ground was broken on the morning of October 15, 1825, at the summit at Lake Hopatcong. Cadwallader Colden gave a speech. The Irish picked up their shovels. I want to talk about the inclined planes, because the planes are the reason this canal is unlike any canal ever built in the United States, before or since. A regular canal climbs hills with locks. A lock is a stone box with two sets of doors. A boat sails into the box. The downstream door closes. Water is admitted from upstream, and the boat rises with the water. When the level matches the upstream pound, the upstream door opens and the boat sails out. The Erie Canal climbed 565 feet from the Hudson to Lake Erie, using 83 locks across 363 miles of comparatively gentle country. The Morris Canal had a problem. It had to climb 1,674 feet across only 107 miles. James Renwick, the Columbia professor, did the math and came back with a number around 300 locks. The Morris Canal could not be built with 300 locks. The cost of stone, of carpentry, of land, of mortar was prohibitive. The summit pound at Hopatcong could not have supplied enough water for that many lockages a day. The canal would have run dry. What Renwick proposed instead was unprecedented, and on the face of it, mad. He proposed taking the loaded canal boat completely out of the water at the base of each major ridge, floating the boat onto a wheeled iron cradle car, hauling that cradle car and that boat together up the side of the hill on a set of iron rails, lifting the whole thing to the top of the ridge, sliding it back into the water of the upper pound, and letting the boat continue on its way. Nobody in America had done this before. The British had done something like it on the Boudet Canal in Cornwall, on a small scale. The idea of hauling a working canal boat with a full coal load of 70 tons up the side of a mountain on a regular basis had never been put into commercial service anywhere in the world. James Renwick said it would work. The company believed him. Construction of the planes was supervised by another engineer, David Bates Douglas, hired away from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1829 to oversee the most difficult part of the build. Douglas had walked the Erie Canal route as a young Army officer. He understood stone, gear, teeth, and water power. By 1831, the canal was opened from Phillipsburg on the Delaware to Newark on the Passaic. The Jersey City extension followed between 1834 and 1836. The thing was alive. Let me describe what a working inclined plane on the Morris Canal actually looked like and sounded like, because once you can see it in your head, you understand the rest of the story. A canal boat coming up to a plane was a long wooden vessel, 87.5 feet from bow to stern, 10.5 feet wide, drawing about 4.5 feet of water when loaded. 70 tons of coal in her belly, 2 mules ahead of her on the towpath, a captain on the tiller, sometimes a wife on the cabin roof, sometimes a small child driving the mules. As the boat approached the base of the plane, the captain unhitched the mule team and walked them around the powerhouse on a separate trail. The boat drifted forward into a wet basin at the foot of the plane. Beneath the surface of that basin, a wheeled iron cradle car sat on a pair of iron rails that ran straight up the slope of the hill. The car was angled in the water to receive the boat. The boat was pulled onto the cradle. Chains were thrown over the boat to bind it to the car. A small bell on the hill rang twice. The plane tender opened the valve. Up on the hill, in a stone chamber the size of a small church, a great water wheel began to turn. The first generation of water wheels on the Morris Canal were 30-foot overshot wheels of cast iron, fed by water dropped from the upper pound through a wooden flume. The wheel was geared through a series of cast iron drums and cogs to a heavy hemp cable. The cable ran down the slope of the hill and connected to the cradle car at the bottom. As the wheel turned, the cable wound onto its drum. The cradle car, with the boat sitting on it and the captain still aboard the boat, began to move. Slowly at first, then steadily, the entire 70-ton load of coal in its wooden hull, 87.5 feet long, was hauled up the side of a New Jersey mountain on iron rails at an angle of about 1 in 12, at a speed of maybe 2 miles an hour. At the top, the car ran out through a saddle of stone and slid down into the upper basin. The boat floated free of the cradle. The mules were brought across the saddle. The captain hitched them up. The voyage went on. 23 of these inclined planes had to be built across the line of the canal. 23 more lift locks did the smaller climbs that the planes did not. The longest of the planes was Plane 9 West at a place called Port Warren in Warren County, 4.5 miles east of Phillipsburg. Plane 9 West climbed 100 feet of vertical lift in 1,510 feet of slope. It was a double-track plane, 2 cradles, one going up while the other came down. The hill is still there. The stone wheel pit is still there. I have walked it. The men who ran the planes were called plane tenders. Each plane required at least 2 on duty. One stood at the controls in the powerhouse and worked the valves and the brake. The other, called the brakeman, rowed the cradle car down to the basin, supervised the loading of the boat, and rowed the cradle car back up with the boat aboard. The plane tenders worked 12 to 18 hours a day during navigation season, which ran from late March until late November. They lived in plane tenders' houses, built by the company on the slope of the hill, often 2-family houses. The wage records I have been able to find suggest plane tenders earned between $25 and $45 a month, plus the house, plus the garden. The brakeman earned less. A single broken cable on a fully loaded inclined plane could kill 4 men inside of 6 seconds. The records of the Morris Canal note multiple plane accidents over the working life of the line. A cradle car running backward down the rails at full speed with a 70-ton coal boat strapped to it was an event the captain riding the boat did not survive. The plane tenders watched the cable for fraying every morning before the first boat came up. Now I want to tell you what happened to the canal in the middle of its life, because this is the part nobody outside of New Jersey remembers. The canal opened in 1831. It carried iron and coal and lumber and brick and gunpowder. By the early 1840s, the original overshot water wheels that powered the planes were starting to wear out. They were also too slow. Demand for Pennsylvania anthracite was growing faster than the canal could move it. The company brought in an engineer named William Talcott, and Talcott did something almost as audacious as Renwick had done a generation earlier. He tore out the great overshot wheels. He replaced them with reaction turbines. A turbine is a different animal from a water wheel. A water wheel sits in the open air. Water falls onto the wheel from above and gravity does the work. A turbine sits underwater in a sealed chamber. Water enters under pressure through curved blades and spins the wheel from inside, the way a lawn sprinkler spins. The reaction turbines that Talcott installed at the planes were made of cast iron, 12.5 feet in diameter, set in a vaulted stone chamber buried below the level of the upper pound. They were called Scotch turbines because the design had been refined in Scotland. The first one was installed at Plane 9 West in the winter of 1851 and 1852. The Scotch turbine at Plane 9 West produced 235 horsepower under a 45-foot head of water, discharging 1,000 cubic feet of water a minute. It could pull a loaded canal boat up an 11% grade without breaking a sweat. By the early 1860s, the conversion to Scotch turbines was complete across the line of the canal. The planes ran faster. The boats moved heavier. The locks were rebuilt to take a larger boat, 87.5 feet long, 10.5 feet wide, capable of carrying 70 tons of coal in a single trip. The water that turned the turbines was the same water that floated the boats, the same water McCulloch had pointed at on Lake Hopatcong 40 years before. The lake fed the Summit Pound. The Summit Pound fed the turbines. The turbines pulled the boats up the plains. The boats brought the coal to the iron furnaces. The iron furnaces fed the engines of a country that was, in the year 1866, putting more tons through this one canal than it had ever moved before. In the year 1866, 889,220 long tons of freight moved over the Morris Canal. Coal accounted for 459,000 of those tons. Iron ore accounted for 290,000 more. Gross revenue that year was $616,350. That number is the high water mark. It is the year the canal reached its peak. It is the last good year. I want to be honest with you about what was already coming for the canal in 1866, even on its best day. While the boats were running up Plane 9 West and the Scotch turbines were humming in their vaulted chambers, the railroads were finishing their parallel lines across the same New Jersey countryside. A train pulled 100 tons of coal at 30 miles an hour and did not stop for winter. A canal boat pulled 70 tons at 2 miles an hour and shut down for 5 months a year while the canal was frozen. The mathematics of the new century were not on the side of the mules. In the year 1871, the Lehigh Valley Railroad, looking to acquire the canal's valuable terminal real estate at Phillipsburg on the Delaware and at Jersey City on the Hudson, took a long lease on the Morris Canal and Banking Company. The Lehigh Valley never made a dollar of operating profit on the canal itself. The railroad kept the canal running, but it ran the canal down. Maintenance fell off. Boats sat idle. The planes ground on. By the year 1900, the tonnage was a small fraction of what it had been in 1866. By 1912, a state commission was recommending abandonment. The state of New Jersey took over the canal in 1922. Formal abandonment came in 1924. What happened next was the part of the story that hurts. Between 1924 and 1929, the canal was systematically destroyed. The order came down from the state. The directing engineer for the dismantling was Cornelius Clarkson Vermeulen. The locks were broken open. The wooden gates were burned. The Scotch turbines, those great cast iron machines that had pulled millions of tons of coal up the side of the New Jersey hills for 60 years, were pulled out of their vaulted chambers and sold for scrap. The iron rails were torn up. The cradle cars were cut apart. The plane tenders, the lock tenders, the brakemen, the mule drivers, the boat captains, the boatmen's wives and children, all of them walked off the canal for the last time and went home to find other work. The Bird family closed the door of the lock house at Lock 2 East. 4 generations of one family had worked that single lock. The door closed in 1924 and did not open again as a working lock house until the modern restoration. The 2 unnamed sons of an Irish laborer dead of cholera in 1832 had grown up, had had children of their own, had become canal boat captains and plane tenders, and they too walked away. The work was gone. The line was gone. The water was let out of the channel. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. 1 click. Come back. There is one man I have not told you about yet, and I want to bring him in now, because what he did is the reason you and I can stand at Plane 9 West today and see what was there. His name was James S. Lee Sr. He was born around the turn of the 20th century, grew up in Phillipsburg, worked as a conductor on the Central Railroad of New Jersey, and served in the Second World War. His great-grandfather had been a captain on a Morris Canal boat. His grandmother had been born on the deck of a canal boat and had walked the towpath as a small child, driving the mules for her father. When Lee came home from the war in 1946, he and his wife Mary bought what had been the plane tender's house at Plane 9 West, 4.5 miles east of Phillipsburg. The plane was gone. The cradle cars were gone. The turbine was buried in mud and stone. The wheel pit was filled in. Jim Lee got a shovel and started to dig. For the next 60 years, until his death in 2007, James Lee Sr. and his wife Mary excavated the remains of Plane 9 West by hand. They cleared the tail race. They opened the vaulted stone chamber where the Scotch turbine sat. They found the turbine itself, intact, sitting where the dismantling crews of 1924 had left it. Jim Lee became one of the foremost living authorities on the Morris Canal. He wrote 2 books on the subject, including a collection of stories from old canal boatmen titled Tales the Boatman Told. He turned the plane tender's house into a museum. The American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Scotch turbine at Plane 9 West a National Historic Engineering Landmark. The work the dismantling crews had nearly erased was, by the time Lee was done, partially visible again. Here's what the Morris Canal accomplished in its working life, when you add the numbers up. Built between October of 1825 and the opening run of 1831, completed end-to-end in 1936 with the Jersey City extension, the Morris Canal moved bulk freight across 107 miles of country at an elevation gain and loss of 1,674 feet. It did this with 23 lift locks and 23 water-powered inclined planes. The longest plane carried boats 100 feet of vertical lift and 1,510 feet of slope. The original initial section cost was $2,104,413. The peak year, 1866, saw 889,000 long tons of freight cross the line. Coal from the Lehigh Valley fed the iron furnaces of Newark for 40 years because of this ditch and these machines. A generation of New Jersey ironworkers, brickmakers, and lumber merchants existed in their trade because the canal made it economical for them to exist. The Irish laborers who dug it with shovels and wheelbarrows for $1 a day, who slept in canvas tents, who died of cholera by the hundred and were buried in unmarked graves along the line, made it possible for an entire region of the country to industrialize. When the canal closed in 1924, and when the dismantling crews finished their work in 1929, a New Jersey reporter walked the line and wrote that what was left looked like the bones of a great long animal that had crawled across the state and died with its head in the Delaware and its tail in the Hudson. He was almost right. What was left was the bones, the stone wheel pits, the foundations of the plain tenders' houses, the cuts in the hillsides, the empty channel slowly filling with brush. The men who had run it walked away. The names of most of them were never written down. The Bird family at Lock 2 East closed their door for the last time as canal workers in the spring of 1924. The lock is still there in the town now called Wharton. It has been restored. The tender's house has been furnished with antiques to look the way it would have looked when the Birds lived in it. The interpreters at the door can tell you what life was like for a lock tender's family, but they can no longer tell you the first names of the men and women who actually did the work. The records pass on the family name. The rest is gone. The Irish laborer in his unmarked grave somewhere in the fields of central New Jersey has no marker at all. There was no headstone. The company buried hundreds of them in 1832 and again in the years that followed. They were buried at Bull's Island, at 10 Mile Run, at the Griggstown Cemetery, in the dirt along the canal banks. The ledger gives no name, only a number. He paid for the canal with his life, and the canal forgot him. I have walked the line of the Morris Canal in the country, between Lake Hopatcong and Phillipsburg. I have stood on the stone foundation of the powerhouse at Plain 9 West, in the field that James Lee cleared by hand. I have looked down the slope where the iron rails used to run, where a 70-ton canal boat with a captain on the tiller and a wife on the cabin roof and a small child driving the mules would have been hauled up over the saddle of the ridge and slid down into the upper pound sometime between 1831 and 1924. The slope is grown over now. The brush has come back. If you did not know what had been there, you would walk past it without slowing down. I have been doing this work, this kind of reading and walking and counting, for a long time. The thing that keeps me coming back is not the iron and not the engineering, though those are remarkable. It is the men and the women. It is the 4 generations of Birds at Lock 2 East who answered the knock at 2 in the morning. It is the Irish laborer in his unmarked grave, dead at 25 for $1 a day. It is the great-grandfather of Jim Lee, who was a boat captain on the Morris Canal and whose name I have not been able to find. It is the small child of an unknown canal captain, walking behind a mule team for 15 miles a day, who grew up and grew old without ever being asked her name by anyone keeping records. This is the country those people built. The Morris Canal carried the coal that fed the furnaces, that made the iron that built the cities that we live in. The men who did the work paid the price and went home and were forgotten. I read their numbers in the company books and I try to give them back what I can. A name where I can find one. Avage. A fate. A line of pages in a script. It is the least we owe them. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Iron Pioneers before you go. Every week I bring back another piece of this history. I would like you here for it. See you in the next one.